All right. I think we got all these computer stuff working here. You can go ahead and open your Bibles to Isaiah. We're going to really be looking at Isaiah 42. You'll see it coming up here on the overhead in just a second. But before we get into Isaiah 42, to really set that up, I wanted to actually do some reading. And let me get my Bible. Out of Isaiah 53. And I think it's important because it kind of sets up what I really want to talk about. As you can see here coming up on the screen, Isaiah 42 really describes the coming Messiah as the servant king. And for us to really grasp the significance of that and the importance of that, we kind of need to set the stage a little bit. And so I thought it might be helpful for us to take a look first at Isaiah 53. This is a passage that's often read. Drew did a great job of helping prepare our minds for the partaking of the Lord's Supper. And very often, fellows will refer to Isaiah 53 because it's clearly talking, and Isaiah 53 is clearly talking about Jesus' crucifixion, how he's going to be rejected, how God sends his son into the world, and you'd expect the world to accept him with open arms because it's just a wonderful thing that God is doing, thinking about the salvation of all mankind. And yet his reception was the exact opposite. It ended up in his complete rejection. It ended up in his murderous crucifixion. And so very often, to help prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper, this passage out of Isaiah 53 is read. So that's where I wanted to stop, just to kind of set up when we go back and look at chapter 42 here. So in Isaiah 53, beginning at verse number 1, Isaiah continues. He says, "Who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we have hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed." Now that's just a portion of this beautiful prediction, this prophecy that talks about how when the Messiah comes, he will be rejected, he will be treated grossly, he will be killed, he will be murdered for our sin, not for his. And so it's very appropriate that we use this passage to help prepare our minds for the partaking of the Lord's Supper, because it talks about the profundity of the suffering. And that's something that is important that we understand, that this is a powerful passage that shows so much of the suffering that Jesus, as the Messiah, would have to endure on this earth. Upon his because of his death on the cross. And as I said, we rightly often emphasize that terrible suffering that Jesus had to endure. But that suffering that clearly is the focal point of Isaiah 53, that suffering has a larger context, and that will help set the stage for Isaiah 42. That larger context is about much more than suffering. What Isaiah wants you and I, what he wanted his original readers to understand, is that there's more to really understanding this coming king. There's more to really understanding what it means for the Messiah to come and what he will be like once he gets here than just the idea of suffering. Now, that's a big part of it. But it's that larger context that you need to understand Isaiah 53 and this idea of him being suffering on our behalf is just one of many characteristics, one of many elements that are necessary to properly understand the Messiah, and especially to understand the idea as Isaiah presents him as a king. And so that's really what we're going to look at. And so to understand what it means for Christ to be a king, we kind of have to invert our thinking. We need to incorporate that idea of suffering into it, but that's just one of the elements. That's just one of the aspects. The larger overall concept is the idea of service, that it's not really just the idea of suffering. If I was going to pick up one word to describe Jesus and his role as our king, as our Messiah, as our Savior, it would be this word servant, service. And he was so dedicated to service that he's willing to suffer on our behalf. He's a king who's willing to suffer on our behalf. But it's more that idea of being a servant that I think is of vital importance that we understand it. And then even that, we have to make sure that we appreciate the different kind of king that he's going to be. And that was something, in studying the New Testament, you saw how the 12 disciples struggled with that idea, that when Jesus would talk about, well, I'm going to have to go to Jerusalem and they're going to kill me. And their reaction was, well, no way, we're just not going to let that happen. Well, a big part of the reason they had that reaction is because they couldn't grasp a king. They knew that Jesus was the Messiah. They knew that he was this king that all the Old Testament prophets, guys like Isaiah, promised. They knew that, but it was their concept of, well, what is a king, that was tripping them up. And they were letting kind of the world define that for them. And so this is something that's vitally important that we understand, that Isaiah will help us understand that Christ is a savior. He's a king, but he's not the kind of king, he's not the kind of leader that the disciples were initially thinking about. He's not the kind of king, he's not the kind of leader that the world typically thinks about. Stop and think, even in America, our history begins with a revolution, doesn't it? Who did we revolt against? A king, didn't we? King Charles of England. And so even in our culture today, Americans don't typically think of kings very favorably, right? Kings are kind of bossy, aren't they? They're kind of dictatorial. They make bad decisions. And so we think of a king as something that's kind of bad. Or if we don't think of it, that's maybe our historic view of what kings are like. But today, when you think of, British royalty, did you see that goofy picture of King Charles with that big poofy crown on his head and these big flappy ears sticking out? He just looks like a goofball. All right. And that's kind of how we think of him. Right. I know some of you are really into that royalty thing. So that's cool. That's okay. But see, that's my point. It's just kind of a royalty thing, right? It's kind of cool. It's kind of traditional. It kind of is neat to think about. And Prince Charming kind of a thing, and so we think of the old, Disney cartoons like Sleeping Beauty and that. And that's okay. But we don't really think of it that way as really being involved. So if, there's something really going on big with Putin invading the Ukraine, the world doesn't really think, well, what does King Charles say we ought to do? Right? It's just kind of a figurehead. It's nice. It's a good tradition. So what I'm saying is, either you have this kind of enculturated view of a king. You think back in American history and King Charles, and they're bossy and they're dictatorial and they're not very nice and they're not good, and you need to revolt against those kinds of guys. Or you think of them as the present King Charles and they're just kind of goofy, silly, and irrelevant. They don't really matter. It's kind of nice fluff, pomp and circumstance. They put on a great show, but they don't really matter. If that's what you think is Isaiah's idea, then you're not understanding Isaiah. Okay, that's what we need to figure out. We need to know what's Isaiah talking. And so basically you take all those ideas that we have, kings are bad and dictatorial, or kings are irrelevant, and you just invert all of that. And that's what we're going to really be doing here in our study. So as we talk about the servant king, let's just jump in and understand that he's not like the historic kings that we think about as being bossy or dictatorial. He's not like the modern day royalty that's largely kind of nice, but it's just a bunch of show. It's just pomp and circumstance. It doesn't really signify a whole lot as far as, really important things, and real leadership is concerned. And that's what Isaiah 42 is talking about. So let's just jump in here. And it really talks about the idea of being a servant, which is, I think, the core idea, needing to understand what Isaiah wants to say about this coming Messiah, this coming king. So Isaiah 42, verses 1-7, behold my servant, right there. That's it. That's the prime idea. It's not just suffering. Suffering is an aspect. He's a servant willing to suffer, but here he's hitting the nail right on the head. This is what we need to understand about this coming Messiah, this king. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my elect one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoking flax he will not quench. He will bring forth justice for truth. He will not fail nor be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands shall wait for his law. Thus says God, the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it, who gives breath to all people on it, and the spirit to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. So there's a couple of salient features here. The first idea is of justice, and the second idea is of liberation. You will notice both of those themes in this king that he's talking about, his servant. The idea of bringing forth justice is mentioned a couple of times in the passage, that he will establish justice for the Gentiles. He will spread justice out from the coastlands. It will go all over the earth. So that's one of the focal points. This is a just king. This is not a dictatorial king. This is not a martinet. This is a just king, and this is what we need to understand about him. And then he's also pictured as a liberator, especially down the last couple of verses. You will see this idea of, a rescuer, a liberator, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. And that makes me think of, like, in World War II, when the Allied forces went into Europe and how they were seen as liberators. That's a very romantic notion, one that stirs us. And this is exactly the same kind of language that Isaiah is talking about here. So the point that we really need to understand is how radically different a king is. As you see in verse number 4, it talks about he will not fail nor be discouraged till he has established justice on the earth, and the coastland shall wait for his law. And so his law will be universal. That's one of the ideas. The real point here is the way in which, as a king, he goes about establishing his law and enforcing justice. The idea that I think Isaiah wants us as readers to take away from that is, again, it's going to be totally different from the way that man typically thinks. It will not be the means or methods that are typically used by kings and conquerors. The way in which the servant, Jesus, that's how he addresses him in verse number 1, the way that he's going to go about establishing his law and justice is unique in all history. Typically, it's done by force. It's how this nation came to be. We had a revolution, and that's the typical way that you'll see kings going about. When Jesus did come, we've also mentioned this already, that when Jesus did come, when the king did appear, that was a hard thing for the 12 to understand, because they're taking their cue from what kings do from world history. Even the whole idea of justice, that's mentioned a couple of times. This, he will establish justice. Well, when I first read that, I just think of, justice in general, the idea that we'll have, a place where we can all get along. One of the things that's kind of distressing presently is that we're having so much turmoil, especially in the larger metropolitan areas, where you'll hear people complaining about there's no justice. And what I think they're saying about that is that there's not the rule of law. It's just people are just going crazy. Have you heard about all the department stores that are just leaving San Francisco? Why are they leaving? Because they're getting robbed blind, and the police won't do anything about it. They're going broke in San Francisco. So guess what they're doing? They're leaving. Well, see, that's kind of my first thought about this the savages are taking over and we need to establish justice, right? Well, think of it from the standpoint of the 12 when they talk about justice. In the languages especially, look at verse 1, 42:1, he will bring forth justice to the Gentiles. Well, think about how the average Jew thought of their Roman overlords. Do you think that when it says he will bring forth justice to the Gentiles, again, I look at that as an inclusive statement, because, the Jews kind of had this exclusive idea that, well, you guys don't get to be part of the promise. And so I read Isaiah 42:1, and I'm thinking, oh, well, there's a statement right there. Those Jews should have picked up on that it was going to be for everybody. The gospel is for all, right? Well, put yourself in Peter's shoes. Put yourself in the shoes of James and John, living under an oppressive foreign regime. And you hear that there's going to come a king, and this king, this Jewish king, is going to bring justice to the Gentiles. What are you thinking? Yeah, there's going to be some head knocking when this king gets here, and he's going to be showing those stinking Romans who's the boss, right? That's justice. Okay. So the point is I become more sympathetic toward James and John and Peter in their view of, what this prophecy is really talking about. But the real point is that their problem is they're allowing the kings of the world to set their definition of what kings do. All right. And that I think is very problematic. And so we can look at this passage where Jesus says, wait a second, guys, your problem is you're letting the present Caesar set your definition of what kings do. For you guys to be able to understand what me and my Father have planned, you're going to have to reset your definition. You're just going to have to think totally differently about what you think kings do. And this is what I think Jesus says to them here in Matthew 20. Let's take a look at that. In Matthew 20, beginning at verse 25, but Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. So that's your definition. That's your guy's definition of what a king does. But that's not your father's definition. That's not my father's definition. That's not my definition. He will go on to point out, verse 26, yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your, what's the word he uses? Servant. Servant king. Servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be a slave. For just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give his life a ransom for many. And so this is what Isaiah wants us to really understand. You know, what is it that a king does? How does a king act? How does a king behave? And we have to stop allowing the world to set our definition of what our expectations of this king ought to be. We'll talk about this more a little bit later, but I think that's a problem for us as Christians today, because, you know, I mean, I've participated in a lot of conversations, you know, all those stinking politicians today, you know, wait till Jesus gets a hold of them, right? And then I realized, wow, maybe I'm falling into that same trap that the 12 disciples initially fell into, that I'm not thinking of my King, my Savior, my Messiah, Jesus, Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Maybe I'm thinking of him, even though I'm calling myself a Christian, I'm thinking of him in worldly ways. And I'm not really understanding what kind of king that he really is. And so we'll talk more about that. So some of the ways he's different, he's different in his motive. That I think becomes very clear as you look back at verses 1 and 2, Isaiah 42, verses 1 and 2. Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my elect one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. And again, that's the exact opposite. I mean, you look at how leaders and politicians today, they're all crying out, aren't they? They're trying to get onto every news broadcast they can get onto. Their social media, you know, there's some politicians that you know, I wish they would take their Twitter account away from them. It's just ridiculous, the stuff they say. Well, you see how Isaiah is inverting all that? He's saying this is not the kind of leader that he's not your typical run-of-the-mill politician that's just, you know, crying out, seeking adulation, seeking the limelight. And you know, politics is often just nothing more than an avenue for self-promotion, for a self-serving agenda, for their personal enrichment. Not so for this king that Isaiah is talking about. Rather, he will seek not to cry out and, you know, defend himself from any attackers that he might have, which is the typical policy of the run-of-the-mill politician today, and back then as well. He says, I will depend on God. God will uphold me. See, that's what that verse says. Behold, my servant, whom I uphold. He'll depend on me to uphold him. He won't have to be running around seeking the limelight and seeking these things. And so I just find that fascinating. He's taking these typical methods that we see politicians all through history, kings and leaders, rulers, dictators, all through history, even to this very day. He's distancing himself from those motives and seeking self-justification. Look in John 6:38. Jesus says, this is my motive. John 6:38, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And that is one of the things that makes him such a different king. Not only are his motives different, but so are his methods. And so we return back to Isaiah 42, just a couple of verses there. Verse number 3, a bruised reed he will not break, a smoking flax he will not quench. He will bring forth justice for truth. And then dropping all the way down to verse 7, to open blind eyes, to bring out of prisoners, those in prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. So this is really emphasizing his methods that he's going to employ, and they're going to be tender. That's that idea of verse number 3, you know, where he talks about a bruised reed he will not break. The idea that I get from that, a reed is not a very strong instrument to begin with, and a bruised reed is even more weak. Do you remember when Jesus was kind of chastising the people, defending John the Baptist? He's sticking up for John the Baptist, and he says, when you went out to see John the Baptist, what did you go out to see? And then you remember he said, a reed shaken in the wind. Remember he said that? Is that what he's picturing there is a reed is very weak and it just blows whichever. And again, think of politicians today, they just say, well, what's the thing that'll get me elected? That'll be my position. That's my position on that particular issue. Whichever way the wind's blowing, that's the way. And this is not how Jesus operates. See, that's very much, I think, the point that he's also saying, also comparing him to the fact that a bruised reed he will not break. And so the idea is that of tenderness. There's a lot of people in the world today that are like that bruised reed. Their lives are frail, they're weak, they're oppressed, whether it's because of financial burdens, or how about this one? Do any of you dealing with any health burdens right now? See, it's tough, isn't it? And so that's that picture, that bruised reed. And Jesus is so tender, he will carefully pick you up to make sure that he doesn't break you. A bruised reed he will not break, see? And that's the exact opposite. A lot of rulers today, a lot of leaders, what's the saying? If you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. What does that represent? That represents the idea, well, hey, some people got to end up coming out on the short end of the stick. I'm sorry, you're just not very important. It's all for the greater good, right? So we're going to do this, and if it runs over you, if it takes advantage of you, well, such is the price of progress. Okay, Jesus is not that kind of leader. That's what he's saying. That's what he's talking about. His methods are radically different. Okay. Also, down in verse 7. Already mentioned that briefly, the whole idea of being a liberator, freeing us from prison, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison houses. And so all of this is really talking about the idea of helping those who are in positions where they can't really help themselves. And that's what Jesus is all about. He will establish law and justice. Look at this famous plea. This is a passage I quote all the time, Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. You need to understand this more in spiritual terms than really understanding it just physical or material terms, although I think it can apply to that. But listen to this beautiful plea that Jesus makes. Matthew 11, 28. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is the message of our King. And he understands the ravages of sin. He understands what it does to us, and he wants to give us a refuge. That's the prison. It's really the prison of sin. It's all of these decisions that we've made, the wrong choices that we've made. And Jesus is saying, are you tired of that? Is life beating you down? Come to me. I won't treat you that way. I will give you the tools that will help you rebuild a broken life. I will give you rest. I will give you comfort. And that's the kind of King. His methods are radically different than what we typically see in the world. So just a couple of real quick lessons here to draw our study this morning to a conclusion. Really, the idea is that we want to be the same kind of citizens that Jesus, as our King, models for us. And so just like his motives were different, guess what, for us as citizens of his kingdom, so too must our motives be different. Matthew 23, verse 11 and 12, just another citing of a passage that we looked at just a moment ago. Speaking to the disciples, speaking to us, he says, but he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. We need to be looking for opportunities to serve. Just as Jesus came as the servant king, so we must look for these opportunities to serve one another. Out on the bulletin board are lists of various ways that you can get involved in the work. Helping prepare for the Lord's Supper. That's one of the lists out there. The elders have also encouraged you to take part in maybe volunteering to clean the building. That's another list. Interior building cleanup. You can sign up your name for that. Some of you are already very much involved in serving one another by sending out cards, by preparing meals, by visiting one another. Those are all things. This is what Jesus has called us to do, to serve one another. There's so many ways we can do that. I love to teach Bible classes. Maybe you'd like to have a Bible class. Maybe you have someone in your family or a next door neighbor who might be interested, and yet you feel, well, I don't feel comfortable teaching the class. I'd be happy to volunteer. Just give me a call. You know me, once I get talking about the Bible, you're not going to shut me up, right? I love talking about it. So there's all different kinds of ways that you can get involved. You can serve. And your motive for doing that is not like the politicians gaining the limelight. Look at me, look what I do. It's very humble. It's just that simple, humble service. We are motivated by the same thing that motivated Jesus, and that is to do the will of our Father who is in heaven. That's it. Very simple. Likewise, as Jesus' motives were different, our motives must be different. So must our methods. Our methods must be different too. In James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. The main idea that I want to get across is that, and especially in our culture, whenever we have a problem in our culture, we think in terms of some massive government program, don't we? We got to institute some massive government program to take care of this problem. Jesus inverts that and says, forget about massive government programs. I just want to talk to you as one person, to you as an individual. And that's what James 1:27 is talking about. What is pure and undefiled religion? Well, pure and undefiled religion is to build some massive program to take care of widows and orphans. No, it's for me to get involved. It's for me to take that pen, that pencil, and write my name on that volunteer sheet. It's for me to go to the store and buy that card and write a little note in there. Sorry that you're not feeling well. Hope you feel better soon. And put it in an envelope and lick it and put a stamp on it. It's not some program. It's me. It's you. You see that? James 1:27. And what does James call that? Pure and undefiled what? Religion. See, take it down. This is a problem that plagues the church. Churches are thinking in terms of these programs. We got to organize these programs. And there's all kinds of programs. You can sign up. There's all kinds of, international programs to spread the gospel. And you send your money in and we'll put it out up on satellite radio. And come on. That's not pure and undefiled religion. Pure and undefiled religion is to get involved. And it's not just widows and orphans. Widows and orphans is just a shorthand way of saying anybody that is in need, the sick. See, that's taking us back to Isaiah 42, right? That's those people in prison. That's the ones that are oppressed. That's the ones that are facing, some kind of medical procedure. and it's going to be a difficult thing. It's people that are struggling, maybe with health issues, maybe with financial issues. The list is endless. You see, it's me as an individual understanding that we have to have a different methodology about how we think about solving problems and overcoming the struggles that people are having. And again, we tend to think in terms of these big programs. And I'll be honest with you, it's just a way of excusing individual responsibility and put it off on somebody else. We have somebody else to go take care of that, And so that's what Jesus very clearly teaches us. One more passage, Matthew 9:37. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. See, that's the problem. There's plenty of opportunities to serve out there. All we need to do is do what he says in the very next verse. Therefore, pray the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be volunteering as individuals to say, I will be a laborer. I will send the card. I will go visit. I will invite someone over to my house. I will be hospitable. I will be gracious. I will be kind. I will turn the other cheek. The list is endless, isn't it? Of ways that we can serve, simple ways that most of us would say, it's nothing, no big deal. Well, it's a huge deal. It's the very essence of Christianity. It is the essence, that's what James is saying. It's the essence of pure and undefiled religion. Me getting my 10 little fingers involved, actually doing something for the Lord. That's what Jesus did. And so ought you and I. Well, that's what Isaiah is talking about, the servant king. And so, as Jesus himself was different in his motives, as Jesus himself was different in his methods, so must we be. Characterized by real compassion, characterized by the willingness to get involved at the individual level. We understand the kind of king we serve. His motives and methods are different. So must be ours. And you can commit to serving that king this morning by coming forward, hearing, believing, repenting, confessing. You can be baptized and added to his glorious body this morning. You can follow in the footsteps of your servant king this morning, and you yourself, like he, can become a servant. Come forward, make those wishes known. While together we stand and sing.